Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Thank you very much for joining us. I am really happy to welcome General James Slife, who is the commander of Air Force Special Operations Command in Hurlburt Field, Florida. Welcome, General Slife. For those of you who don't know a lot about Air Force Special Operations Command, AFSOC is the Air Force component of U.S. Special Operations Command and has approximately 20,800 active duty reserve, Air National Guard, and civilian professionals underneath him. General Slife was born outside of Detroit, Michigan, and grew up in Hot Springs, Arkansas. He was commissioned through the ROTC program at Auburn University and has spent the majority of his career in special operations aviation assignments and has deployed extensively, flown MH-53, MQ-1, and other type of aircraft. Welcome, General Slife. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Dr. Jones. It's good to be with CSIS today, and I appreciate the opportunity to offer just a few remarks, and then I look forward to kind of getting into the questions. As I think about the opportunities in front of us as we sit here in 2020, I got to tell you, this is a really exciting time to be at the Air Force Special Operations Command, and I feel that way because as I look back on my career, I'm the first commander of the Air Force Special Operations Command that has spent his entire career in an Air Force that had such a thing as the Air Force Special Operations Command. And so I really kind of grew up and came of age during the formative years of the Special Operations Forces. And so really the 20-year period between 1980 and the failed Iranian hostage rescue mission and the turn of the century. Those were really kind of the formative years for me. And then, of course, the last 20 years have really been defined by the post 9/11 era. And as I look back on kind of the 30 years that I've been around the Special Operations Forces, I feel like we've had a couple of inflection points. One inflection point was clearly the catastrophe at Desert One and what that sparked over the next 20 years for the nation's Special Operations Forces. And during those 20 years, we really built the modern capability of SOF that we have today. And those capabilities were really, I think, characterized by a couple of different things. One, we were geared towards short-term crisis and contingency responses. When we went to war, if you will, it was typically for a very limited duration. It was some, action that was over within days or weeks. And then we'd, come home and reset and get ready to do it again. The other thing that characterized us during those first 20 years was SOF was largely a supporting force to the broader joint force. We provided specialized niche capabilities to enable the joint force to succeed. And after 9/11, I think 9/11 was really an inflection point for us, and we had to fundamentally change who we were, and we've done that for the last 20 years in a couple of ways. Number one, we had to re-gear ourselves to support sustained combat operations over months and years at a time, instead of these kind of short crisis response things that we had previously been organized to do. The second thing is SOF largely became the supported force in counter VEO operations. And so I think that has changed the way we view ourselves, and frankly, it's changed the way others view us. And so that has occurred really over the last 20 years of my career. But as I sit here in 2020 and think about what the future looks like, the future that's described by the National Defense Strategy and other kind of strategic level documents that describe the future operating environment, I think one thing that's clear to us is that the future doesn't look a lot like the present to us. I think the AFSOC that we will need in the future is not the AFSOC that we needed, which is the one that we have today. And so the challenge facing us in 2020 is how do we build the AFSOC that we will need for the future in a flat or declining resourcing environment against the peer adversaries that are challenging United States interests across the globe. So that's really the major challenges for us. And so that's why I say it's an exciting time to be here, because I feel like although, we can't probably put a thumbtack on our calendar like we could on 9/11/2001 and say that was the day where everything changed. We can't quite get to that level of specificity. I think it's clear that we are at an inflection point as significant for us as 2001 September 11th was. It's not marked by a singular event, but it is clearly marked by a shifting security environment. So it's an exciting time to be here, and I'm happy to spend a little bit of time with you today talking about where we are and where we're going and what that might look like for us. So I look forward to your questions and those of your team, Dr. Jones.
Thanks, General Slife. Let me just start off before getting to a range of the issues you just outlined: budget, environment, state adversaries, supported roles. I wanted to start off with a question about your background, because you've got an interesting mix of assignments as a pilot, as a commander at multiple levels, but you also spent time as a Secretary of Defense corporate fellow at Microsoft. And I'm wondering if you can briefly talk about some of the more important lessons you've learned from these assignments that have enabled you and helped you along the way, including in your current capacity, including your time actually at Microsoft, which I'm sure is kind of an interesting outside of the DoD perspective on how corporate America works.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I am a little, you of course are familiar with the special operations community from your own background. And, one of the things that characterizes many of our career paths is we tend to be fairly narrow and deep. And I've got a little, I'm a little bit of a deviant from that model. I do have a number of assignments outside the special operations community. Certainly the year I spent at Microsoft was formative. I've spent a few years working on the Secretary of Defense's staff, both in the programming realm and also in the acquisition and technology realm. Spent some time at U.S. Central Command and over in Korea as the Chief of Staff for U.S. Forces Korea. So I have had a number of kind of assignments outside of SOF that I think helps me have maybe a different view of us than might be more normal. One of the things that I picked up on at Microsoft the first time was really the value of diversity in whatever team we find ourselves in. And I went to Microsoft thinking that the observations I would have would all be IT related, right? I thought I would go to Microsoft and figure out how the professionals use SharePoint, since I could never seem to figure it out for myself. And so that was the kind of observation I thought that I would have. And instead, what I found was an environment that viewed diversity as a business advantage. And so, when I looked at my own upbringing, my own experiences in the Air Force, I think in many ways we tried to blend out diversity. We try and see everybody through the lens of, hey, you're just an airman. I don't want to know what your gender is, and I don't want to know what color your skin is. You're just an airman. We're all just airmen, right? And so, it's almost like we try and blend out the diversity in our organization was my experience up to that time. And what I found in Microsoft was that they really not only celebrated the diversity of the workforce, but they actually recruited for diversity because it provided an advantage, not because it was the socially correct thing to do or, to correct some past injustice, but rather because this improves the bottom line for us to have a more diverse workforce. And so that really made me kind of revisit my own assumptions about what diversity and inclusion meant. And so this has been a kind of a 15-year aha thing for me to realize the value of diversity for the mission. And so that I guess would be something that I would say being outside the SOF community for a little while has helped me see. The other thing that I think, I'm certainly not unique in the SOF enterprise in having this appreciation, but, time in DC, time working for the Secretary of Defense's staff really brings into sharp focus how important it is for us to maintain relationships across not only our own department, but over on Capitol Hill, having flat communications with our legislators so they understand exactly what we're doing, and so we can listen to what their concerns are with things that we might be doing. I think I've got a real appreciation for the value of relationships, particularly in and around Washington as they pertain to not only our operations but our resourcing decisions that we make and things of that nature. So those would just be a couple of things I'd highlight for you.
Those are important ones, and certainly ones that I think any institution, both in the government and outside, are dealing with right now, particularly the diversity one. Let me switch gears. You mentioned it in your opening remarks. Let me switch gears to the budget environment. And if one looks at the fiscal environment, including deficits, you look at the sort of COVID and potentially post-COVID environment, there are lots of questions about defense budgets. And so from your perspective, from the AFSOC perspective, what does possibly shrinking or even flatlining budgets mean for AFSOC? How does that make you think about legacy capabilities and the potential for shedding some of those? How does it also impact how you think about experimentation and innovation, including what some may call failing quickly in this kind of an environment? So really, how does the budget environment affect a number of issues that you have to deal with?
Well, that's as I talk inside the command, as I talk about the decisions that we will make and this kind of distinction between the AFSOC that we will need and the AFSOC that we needed. As we talk about that distinction, the thing that is crystal clear to me is that if the AFSOC that we need in the future is different than the one we have today, if you accept that proposition, and if you accept the proposition that we will have flat or declining resourcing with which to work, the only conclusion that one can come to is that we have to stop doing some stuff. We have to divest to invest. We're not going to be able to transform ourselves if we don't stop doing some of the things that perhaps have been very dear to us for the last 20 years. They've been exactly what we needed to be doing for the last 20 years, but they may not necessarily be relevant to the future. And so I think there probably, if we were to kind of open up the hood of the car here and shine a light in, one of the things we might find under the hood is that there are things that we have taken on inside of AFSOC, certainly, I won't speak for others, that are perhaps commodity activities. They're things that we're not the unique providers of these capabilities. We're not the only people that do these things, but we've taken them on because, maybe it's easier to do it for ourselves than it is to have to rely on somebody else to do it for us, or we do it faster than others might do it, or whatever the reason might be. But I think we have to look hard and decide, what are we doing that are commodity activities that we're not the kind of unique providers of these capabilities for the joint force. And those are the things that, no matter how dear to us they may have been for the last 20 years, we're going to have to bring ourselves to the point where we can cut loose of some of those things in order to invest in the things that we think might be more relevant to the future operating environment. So whether we have a flatline budget or whether we have a reduction of some percentage, I think either way that the calculus is the same. We have to look ruthlessly at what we have been doing and what we're going to be required to do, and make the trades necessary to position ourselves for the future.
So as you look at the future and you look at what types of capabilities, systems, platforms, even broadly speaking, you see in the future environment, what do you see as some of the more important items you've got to focus on?
So I would say probably the one that I'm spending more time on right now than anything else is I believe that the service components of SOCOM are most effective for SOF when we're closest to our parent service. I think what SOCOM needs from me is they need me to be really, really closely connected to my parent service. If they needed, more SEALs, they'd probably go find more SEALs. They don't need me to, try and produce Air Force SEALs. We would need to go find more SEALs. And what I can uniquely provide to SOF is the connective tissue to my parent service. And so I've been focusing pretty hard on looking for those opportunities to draw the connective tissue back a little more closely together between SOF and my service, the United States Air Force. And so I think there are things that the Air Force will be well positioned to do to help accomplish special operations missions in the future. And so I need to help bridge that gap. But the other thing that I need to do is there are places where SOF can be very valuable to Air Force component commanders in the future operating environment, whether it's in conflict or whether it's in the competitive phase. There are things that SOF is uniquely postured to do for air components that will be really important to us in the future. And so, when I described at the beginning how we had kind of shifted from being a supporting force to being a supported force, I think, what I'm saying is I believe that we need to return to being a supporting force to the larger joint enterprise. And for me, that means the United States Air Force. So that's probably the area that's attracting more of my attention than anything else right now is what should AFSOC and SOF be doing to provide unique value to air component commanders.
Well, one of the issues that certainly has evolved over the past couple of years, and I think will in the foreseeable future, is the broader threat landscape for the United States. And it's probably most clearly written in the 2018 National Defense Strategy under, at the time, Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis. And so part of the question here is the U.S. is moving in a direction where counterterrorism and efforts against violent extremist organizations is shifting, and it's shifting towards competition with states like China, Russia, and even in the Middle East to some degree, Iran. So from your perspective, what are the most significant challenges, maybe even opportunities, that you see from an AFSOC perspective in competing with these state adversaries? I mean, when you look at their capabilities, particularly the Chinese and the Russians, cyber, space, air, intelligence. I mean, we've even seen in the fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh the use of lethal unmanned aerial systems as part of the campaign, in part with Turkish support. But what do you see as the impact of the shift to competition with state adversaries, and how is that impacting how you're thinking and planning for the future for AFSOC?
So I mean, you've accurately described kind of the moment in time we're living in, where we're looking at the future and we're saying, boy, this really doesn't look a lot like the last 20 years does. Although we have to continue to maintain pressure on those violent extremist organizations that would do us harm. But apart from that, where is it that AFSOC has a role to play? And I think the answer is clearly found in the irregular warfare annex to our national defense strategy. You know, a lot of people kind of conflate counterterrorism operations with SOF and SOF with irregular warfare. And these three things all kind of get lumped together, but they're actually very different, right? And so our counterterrorism operations or counter VEO operations, that is a particular target set that we have a particular set of tactics, techniques, and procedures that we employ to be effective in that environment. But irregular warfare is much broader than that, and it involves the whole of the joint force. It's not uniquely SOF, and it's not even mostly SOF. It is how we compete below the threshold of armed conflict with state adversaries, and there are portions of that that are clearly geared towards the types of capabilities that the Special Operations Forces bring to bear in support of the joint force. And so as I look at, you know, Russia and China and Iran and really the broader security environment as you described it, I think there is a lot of wide open running room for SOF generally, the Air Force Special Operations Command specifically, to focus on irregular warfare operations as part of the broader joint force.
So one issue that comes up along these lines is there's been talk about the evolution from, you know, specialized crisis and contingency response and AFSOC being involved in a contingency response force optimized for theater engagement during what we often call the global war on terrorism. How do you see that evolving, particularly at the theater level, when dealing with some of these, whether it's violent extremist organizations or whether it's dealing with some of these state adversaries?
So I think one of the things that SOF has has developed some expertise in over the last couple of decades is what I would describe as campaigning activities. In other words, linking together individual operations, activities, investments that we might be making, linking them together over time, you know, kind of in a temporal puzzle of sorts, in order to achieve theater-wide objectives. And so it's not necessarily about an individual operation or an individual mission that we might plan, but rather it's about how do we link those together for some longer term objectives. It's really the heart of strategy, is how we conduct campaigning activities. And so one of the places where I think we've got a great opportunity to partner with the rest of the joint force is in helping develop campaigns for theater-wide engagement below the threshold of armed conflict. This is actually a place where we have found some success early on with some of our theater engagements around the globe.
I want to just turn briefly to, and we sort of talked around this when we talked about the shift in part to state competitors. I mean, but this is probably just as true in dealing with violent extremist organizations. And there's a component of it in various forms that's been called elements of foreign internal defense, but it really gets to assisting partners and partner forces. So, you know, certainly as the US competes with the Russians and the Chinese and even the Iranians, you're talking about pretty broad areas in Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East. And the question here is, how are you thinking about assistance to partner forces in those areas? What types of activities and capabilities do you assess are important for AFSOC in training, advising, assisting, and other types of help for these partner nations?
So I think this is a question of means and ends, and assisting partner militaries, whether we frame it under the rubric of security force assistance or foreign internal defense, we have to be clear about whether that is a means or an end. And I would suggest to you that that's a means. We shouldn't be engaged in those type of activities because because that is the valuable end in and of itself. It should be for purpose. And so if there is a partner in a particular part of the world that needs our assistance in order to resist the overtures from a global competitor, for example, then I think that that's a place where we ought to employ the full spectrum of our advisory capabilities to help those partners push back on a global competitor. It helps the United States compete in terms of access and influence. And so I think those are the things that should motivate our security force assistance actions, and not just doing the things that we always do because it's what we always do. And so, if a particular partner or potential partner nation were to ask for U.S. assistance in building a specialized air power capability that AFSOC could assist them with, I would ask why. What is it that is of value to the United States in taking on an engagement like that? So I guess I would tell you, I think that the key question we need to ask ourselves is to what end? And the ends ought to always be framed against our national defense strategy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's important to put it in that context that working with partner nations is not an end in itself. If it occurs to meet a bigger, more important, certainly more strategic objective that ties directly back to our national defense strategy, and then even more broadly to US's national security strategy. Let me just turn briefly to the issue of innovation and acquisition, and get your thoughts on, as you look down the road, what types of, at least broadly speaking, what types of systems or platforms or capabilities do you assess are likely to be important in the future? I mean, as one looks at AFSOC today, AFSOC, it looks like will likely need to replace the CV-22 Osprey. There are a range of questions also about close air support, precision strike, ISR missions. So how do you see acquisition evolving to meet the needs of the future for AFSOC?
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right that these are all questions that we're going to have to struggle with, and we're going to have to view it through the lens of the resourcing environment that we described earlier. One of the things that I'm keen for us to focus on is how do we use the capabilities that we have in a way that is more relevant to the future operating environment. So in other words, we're on the tail end of a C-130 recapitalization effort. Now, it would be fantastic if I could go buy an invisible C-130. But the reality is that an invisible C-130 is probably beyond the means that I have available. And so I got to figure out what to do with the C-130s that I've got. And if I can figure out how to make that C-130 invisible at a critical moment in time, perhaps that is sufficient. Maybe I don't need to go buy an invisible C-130. Maybe I just need to create, the perception of invisibility at a particular moment in time. And so how do we use what we have in kind of novel and creative ways that are relevant to that future operating environment, rather than, sitting around and thinking big thoughts about teleportation machines and invisibility cloaks, which is, what we normally do, frankly. I mean, I think sometimes we get a little infatuated with the technology, and we need to spend a little less time thinking about technology and a little more time thinking about innovative concepts for employing the technology that we have.
Well, if you figure out a solution to the invisibility cloak, please let me know. My kids would be very interested in that, I think.
Yeah, we're well on our way. So I'll keep you posted.
Okay. I wanted to touch base briefly as we're finishing up on human capital, because it's an issue you raised earlier, including in the arena of diversity. But I wanted to talk a little bit also about the transition, or the possible transition, that AFSOC is in right now. As you look at the past 2 decades since 9/11, AFSOC has certainly been involved in wartime missions. There have been questions about whether other requirements have slipped. I mean, understandably slipped, such as training rigor or adherence to standards, or high-risk activities. Some have called this a culture of complacency, and this is probably true across. It's a question certainly across the military. It's certainly not just to the special operations community. But how do you view this goal of or the challenge of now rebalancing the force in a time where it's not clear we're going to have the same type of high operational tempo that we faced in the last 2 decades? So how are you thinking about human capital in that environment?
So you've put your finger precisely on the central issue identified in last year's SOCOM comprehensive review. The SOCOM commander, as you may know, General Clark, commissioned a comprehensive review to evaluate where we are as a command in the aftermath of nearly 20 years of high tempo operations. And the central finding of the SOCOM comprehensive review was that we have systematically overvalued operational activity at the detriment of deliberate leader development and force generation type activities. And so, what does that actually look like? What that actually looks like is spending more time focused on getting out the door for the next deployment than it does in kind of returning from the previous deployment and rebaselining our risk norms and having leaders involved in day-to-day high-risk training activities that we all undertake across SOC. We're certainly guilty of that in AFSOC. I mean, when we looked across our own formation in the aftermath of a couple of fatal training mishaps earlier this year and late last year, that's exactly what we found, was that we had created an environment where our units were so busy getting ready for the next thing that they weren't, paying attention to basic blocking and tackling. That's not a unit problem. That's a headquarters problem. We created that environment. And so the single thing that will probably have more lasting impact on our ability to correct that deviance that we created was the transition to a deliberate unit-based force generation model, whereby unit commanders, rather than sending individual singletons out the door for their next deployment on a continual basis, unit commanders have the ability to bring their entire unit through a train up, deployment, and reconstitution cycle before doing it over again. This is common in some parts of the military. It is not common inside of AFSOC. And so this has been our primary organizational adjustment over the last year, is the transition to a deliberate unit-based force generation model, which will afford commanders the opportunity to be more invested in the training and development of the human capital under their charge. So I appreciate you giving me an opportunity to answer that question, because that is central to everything else that we're doing at AFSOC.
Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate the time you've spent with us. We've covered everything from your biography, including your time outside of DoD at Microsoft, the budget environment we're in, competition against state adversaries, issues related to innovation, acquisition, and most recently, human capital. My final question may be the most difficult, which is, what is your assessment as we move into the tail end of the football season about Auburn's prospects, including with the Iron Bowl? Any thoughts about Auburn football from an alumni?
Yeah, so my prediction is that Auburn will be playing in the postseason, and I think you can take that to the bank. And I would say that the Iron Bowl is always sporty, and no team and no coach has had Nick Saban's number over the last decade more consistently than Auburn under Gus Malzahn. So that one's always a coin flip, and I think it'll be a close game again this year. But I think you can take it to the bank that Auburn will be in the postseason.
Great. Well, General Slife, Commander, Air Force Special Operations Command, thank you again for joining us at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Jones. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you again. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks.